Well, JP Kloppers of Brandseye, the CEO of Brandseye, is here with us. This week has been all about the upcoming municipal elections. Parties, of course, have been campaigning. We've got thousands of candidates in these elections. Hundreds of parties, literally. I think it's a couple of hundred parties that are contesting the election. Of course, 2 or 3 big ones, the ones we focus on. And representatives have been taking to the microphone, to television, to interviews to drum up support. So ahead of South Africans taking to the ballot box next week, we have JP here with us. That's in a moment. Right, this week has been about those elections. So JP, let's talk about what these conversations on the social media with the elections has been like.
Great, thanks David, good to be here again. Yeah, we're definitely seeing a ramp up in the conversation as we get closer to the 3rd of August, and a lot of contesting, particularly around Nelson Mandela Bay, Joburg and Pretoria, as things start to hot up.
So what's emerging? What is the social media saying? Because the opinion polls, which is not social media, that's a commissioned opinion, 5,000 people and so on, indicating that the DA has a big lead in the Nelson Mandela, Port Elizabeth area, a lead also perhaps in Tshwane and Johannesburg.
I think that the challenge that we have in South Africa on social media is just this sort of massive silent majority. I think unlike Brexit, where I think social media in the UK is largely representative of the population, it's not the case in South Africa. So what we're seeing on social media is a lot of the leaders just trying to win votes. They're doing that by getting their message across, but also by kind of running others down. And so we've seen a lot of that in the last week, a lot of positive conversation, particularly around Malema and Maimane, but also a lot of attacking of the ANC and of the DA. As we see in the graph. So,
well, let's have a look there. What is that graph telling us? These, of course, are the 3 big parties, even though it's municipal elections.
So here we see not a lot of support on social media for Jacob Zuma and the ANC. 50 kind of comparative to 70 in the DA and 80 or so from the EFF. And what's actually interesting, and I think this is what we're seeing across the board, is the DA and the ANC are almost easy targets for the other parties. The EFF, surprisingly, is not getting a lot of negative.
So is this negative and or positive comment?
Correct, yeah. The blue's the positive and the red's the negative. Yeah. And so a lot of kind of just skullduggery happening online as the advocates are sort of putting negative stuff out about the opposition. And so I think over the next couple of days, the big question is, will that actually resonate with the silent majority?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, what were some of the issues? I mean, the SABC, I don't think the ANC has been quite sure about how to handle the SABC. On the one hand, there was this ban, they appeared to support them. The minister has supported the ban and so on, yet they've then rescinded it. So it seems very confused. I mean, out there, are the people concerned about the SABC?
We haven't seen too much of it. No, I think in the negative sort of conversation about the ANC, it's more about Zuma corruption, the kind of usual thing. Some of the SABC, but it hasn't been a massive theme in the past week.
What about Musi Maimane? A gamble, I think, in saying that we are taking over the legacy of Nelson Mandela. In other words, saying if Nelson Mandela were here, he wouldn't like what the ANC is doing now. Now, that's a big risk.
Yeah.
And, of course, the ANC then jumped onto all the things Nelson Mandela said a long time ago about the DA. Has it worked for them? What's the social media told us there?
I think it has. It's my kind of opinion.
Because no one actually owns Mandela, although the ANC says it does.
Exactly. And so the big question is, and I think they're playing their cards right by doing it, is by trying to sort of brand associate with Mandela, is seeing how many of the ANC voters can they move. Now we see the EFF trying to do a similar thing. They're not going after the Mandela name, but they're going after the big issues, land reform, the usual things that Malema will talk about, and the stuff that 80% of the population really cares about.
And making promises, like huge increases in social grants, which just aren't affordable, but it sounds good to people who want more money.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about Julius Malema? I mean, of all the leaders, there's no doubt he's the most media friendly. He understands where the camera is. He understands how to play to it. Yeah. He's got a gift for the telling phrase. He has a way of just capturing the attention.
Yeah, he is a masterful politician. We've got to give him that. And I think comparing him with My Mum, as we've done in some of the statistics, you can see them actually generating a similar amount of engagement online. And that's surprising, because the audience that Malema is going after is not a big social media audience. You would kind of expect a lot of engagement from Musi, just having kind of the upper LSMs who would probably more likely, vote DA. But the fact that Malema is generating that amount of engagement, I found surprising.
Well, let's look at each leader's activity themselves on Twitter. That, I think, is your next graph.
Yeah. So as we look at each leader's graphs, you see these engagement figures.
Here we are. Tell us about that.
So it really is neck and neck there. If you look at the number of tweets.
So just it's the number of tweets. What's the second column?
The second one is engagement.
Meaning?
Number of people who are engaging with that content. So replying or resharing it. And the last one is the share of voice. Now,
we've got 000.
Notable in his absence is Zuma, who says nothing on social media.
Not even his office on his behalf.
Not from his.
No.
He doesn't have a profile that he would tweet from.
Okay.
So it would come from the ANC.
Interesting.
But actually, Musi and Malema will tweet in their own personal capacity.
Let's have a look again at the other two there, the DA and the
So you
EFF.
see it really neck and neck here from an engagement perspective, and that's what matters. People can tweet as much as they like, but are they kind of speaking into a vacuum is always the question. And you measure that by seeing what of this is resonating with the population. And actually here, Malema's ahead, which to me is fascinating. The fact that he's actually generating this level of engagement is going to be interesting come the third.
That is fascinating, although they're in the same territory, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, 248, 285, it's sort of comparable. It's not
correct.
One being in a completely different universe. And then the third one, share of voice, 47%, 53% also. So it'd be interesting.
That's looking at, that takes into account reach, which is the influence of the author that's engaging. And so here what you're probably finding is Malema getting a bit more press conversation in that engagement, which would ramp up that number.
Okay. Let's have a look now, JP, at the online topics discussed, also under those three leaders, looking at the issues that they pulled out. The writing's a little bit small there, so take us through it.
So my mummy looking at kind of vote for change.
What's the picture on the left saying?
That's the Twitter bird with a do not speak mask over its beak.
Okay, nothing there.
So he's not talking about anything. What's clear here is kind of the strategic focus of the two.
Yeah.
My mummy really focused on kind of punting that hashtag vote for change, and we see that coming through strongly, and then really going after Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay. So that's where his focus has been. A lot of campaigning there, a lot of conversation about that, and we see it working. We'll see in the stats that come up a little bit later. They're certainly making good inroads there. Malema, it would appear that his strategy is kind of a more general grassroots strategy, as I mentioned earlier. He's going after kind of the person that is frustrated after 20-something years of democracy and not seeing change, and so trying to win those over, saying the ANC failed you, we're going to deliver.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on then to the 2014 elections. That's the last one that we can compare with, and some of the numbers from those elections.
So here what was interesting is while the population, or the voting sort of population, has grown a little bit from 26 to 27 million, our sort of online authors have grown quite substantially from 90-odd thousand to 130,000. So I think while the online audience isn't yet representative, it's certainly growing at a much faster rate than the population is, which from our perspective is encouraging, because it means the kind of data we can produce becomes more meaningful.
Just to clarify there, in 2014, what was the Twitter penetration?
So in people...
in the last 2 years, how much has it increased?
So in unique authors speaking about it, it's probably increased 40%.
Okay.
So it's a substantial number that it's grown by.
Right, and you've said Twitter users in South Africa have grown to 7.4 million. Only 1.8% discussing elections.
So if we look at the whole population, that's our kind of representative sample.
Most people are not interested.
No, it's 1.8% of the population. So of the 27 million people who could vote, 1.8% of those are actually expressing an opinion online.
There we are. There we have. Sorry,
they're the numbers. Yeah.
That came up a bit slowly, but let's just go through that again. 25.3 million. Just explain what's happening.
That's the registered voters have grown from 25 to 26 million, so grown by a million voters.
Right.
Whereas the number of unique authors speaking about the elections over this kind of election period has grown by 35-40%.
Okay.
If we look at the next slide, what's interesting.
Well, let's look at it. So that's 2016 elections, yeah.
So here, looking again, 2014 versus 2016, what we're seeing now in the sort of the share of voice. And if you remember last time in 2014, the EFF has just generated a massive amount of noise.
Correct.
And it's actually less now compared to then.
So is that the novelty factor perhaps wearing off?
I think it's the novelty factor, yeah, because they won 6% of the vote, 6.3% of the vote in 2014. The DA won 22%, and that's what we saw in 2014, and the ANC came out at 62.
So I suppose it's tempting for the DA in particular to extrapolate this and say, well, if we've got that share of voice gone up from 22 to 33, maybe that means an increase in the share of the vote that's the same.
Yeah, and that's certainly what we saw last time. It's almost impossible that it'll grow to 33%. That would be a very remarkable election.
It would.
But what it did show last time was a leading indicator on which direction the vote was going to go. And it's no surprise to say, popular opinion is the ANC is going to lose ground and the DA and the EFF are going to gain.
Yeah.
The big question is by how much. And looking at those stats, it looks like the DA is going to gain more than the EFF will.
Let's have a look at the 2014 elections versus the 2016 elections. Take us through that.
So these are just the big themes that came through. And I think what we've seen, the only change really is the bigger focus, the significant political leaders, that's Mandela. Mm-hmm. Whereas the party leaders are obviously the party leaders. We've seen Nkandla kind of fall off the top 3 list. But these kind of racial discussions still being a very big factor. And I think as I looked at the data from today, the race card, as you call it, is being played more and more. And I think that's in this sort of last-ditch effort to swing the silent majority.
Yeah. And of course, we've moved into uncharted territory. And I think 10 years ago, it would have been, if you'd said the DA would be in a position to take a majority, or at least be the biggest party, if not an overall majority, in places like Nelson Mandela Bay, Tshwane. This is not old white enclaves. I mean, this is major black support that they would be generating.
Yeah.
Is there a racial breakdown on the Twitter sphere so that you can say there's so many black commentators that are, because we're obsessed with race in all other areas?
Yeah. There is. I don't have those stats on me here, but we'll look at those on Monday and Tuesday when we put out sort of the final stats just before the election on Wednesday.
Okay.
But I think just talking about those municipalities, if we look at the share of voice and what's happening there in the next chart, if we bring it up on the screen,
here we are.
We can actually see here that Twitter and social media is actually becoming quite representative of what's happening in those municipalities.
So give us an example there. It's a bit difficult to read the numbers again.
So Western, the yellow is the ANC, blue is the DA, red is the EFF. Yeah. And we see in the Western Cape, it follows just what's happening there. The 47% DA, 36 ANC, and 15 EFF. This is share of voice.
Yeah.
So we haven't overlaid sentiment on this. But in the 2 areas where the EFF is strong, namely Limpopo and the Northwest, you see them growing significantly, even in social media.
So what we're going to have to do, JP, is you're going to have to go back to these numbers when we've got the votes.
That's right.
And see what correlation there was. And then down the line, this becomes a predictor, as you say, an indicator.
So here, if we look at the Gauteng numbers, if we just pull that back up again, while the ANC has got 42% of the kind of share of voice and the DA has got 35%, if you look at that and you kind of extract the advocates, the people who are actually promoting as opposed to just running down one of the other parties, it's actually neck and neck right now between the DA and the ANC in Gauteng.
Fascinating stuff. Let's move now to the second part of JP's analysis, which is the trend tracker. So, what are we talking about here? The first one is ANC supporter conversation.
Yeah, so here we've looked at a word cloud, it's kind of what are the big words that are coming out? When people speak about the ANC, what's it in association with? And one of their campaigns was this Asinavalo. We've pronounced that correctly, but it means we're not afraid.
Okay, so the bigger the word, the more the mention.
The more the mention.
Let's have a look at the next one, DA supporter conversation themes.
So here the DA vote for change massive, and that seems to, it's 4 times bigger than the ANC kind of campaign phrase that we looked at in the last one.
So in other words, they've hit on a phrase which is more dominant than the ANC's.
And it's resonating with people.
And let's look at the EFF one. conversation.
EFF is EFF Waya Waya, which means EFF all the way, and it's actually smaller than the ANC phrase. So again, they're trying to push that, but it's not necessarily generating the same amount of resonance.
Okay, so, and that's it from the trend tracker, and that's it from Brand's Eye. And I think that's, personally, I find that the most fascinating one you've done, because I like elections, and anything that can tell us a little bit more about how to think about the election time. It sounds like this is going to become a very useful tool.
I hope
the democracy in action between elections through the Twitter sphere.
The voice of the people, you know, that's what elections are about, and that's what social media is about.
Right, thanks to JP Kloppers. He's the CEO of Brand's Eye.